All right, everybody, let's get started. Sorry for the little hiccup there. Um, we are going to introduce Collide today with GxP compliance in project management, navigating the regulatory landscape. I'll introduce Mary Beth, and then Mary Beth is going to introduce the rest of the panelists. So our agenda is rules of engagement, the brief industry perspective. Collide is going to give their presentation and panelists, and then we'll wrap up with a roundtable and Q&A discussions. We'll also have polls today, so look out for those and try to participate in the polls, and that'll be good. So rules of engagement, pretty simple. Put your questions or your comments in the chat or Q&A box. That if you get, hey, for some reason you have to leave early, but you want to get a question asked, remember this will be recorded. Put it in there. We'll address all questions during the Q&A session. And then, like I mentioned, it's going to be recorded, so you can come afterwards and watch the rest of the recording or watch it again if you want to. On the right here in this QR code, this will be the link to the slides if you want to download those slides as well. So 2015 Visioneers is similar to Collide. We do a lot of consulting and marketing as well. And we want to just give a brief industry perspective before we hand it over. So what is GxP? GxP is an acronym for a plethora of sayings: good documentation practices, good laboratory practices, good clinical practices, good manufacturing practices. At the end of the day, this is put into place to guard. At the end of the day, it's to guard humans and potentially animals for making sure things are done properly, methodically, and correctly, so that when medicines get to patients, people are getting what they think they're getting. So it's a very important regulatory body of compliance. What are the challenges today? And this is really will lead into everything Mary Beth and team are going to talk about. So data integrity and security. The regulatory agencies like the FDA and the European Medicine Association emphasize the need for secure, accurate, and traceable data. Gaps in electronic data handling or insufficient controls over digital systems can result in costly, non-compliant situations. This also includes today now the challenges in validating AI and other algorithms and ensuring robust cybersecurity approaches and measures. There is global regulatory variability. Companies face challenges in adhering to diverse and evolving international guidelines, particularly in markets with differing requirements such as the US, the EU, and Asia. Keeping up with regional compliance mandates, such as the EU's REACH or the US FDA expectation, adds complexity to operations. And then supply chain oversight. Managing third-party dependencies and ensuring quality across the supply chain is increasingly critical. It's complex, the logistics, today's biologics, vaccines, all types of different approaches, new modalities. It gets very complex very quickly. Weaknesses in supply chain audits, supplier validation, materials tracking can lead to significant compliant risks as well. And then lastly, advanced therapeutics and personalized medicine, which I was just talking about. The shift towards these complex biologics and therapies like CAR T, gene editing, is at the edge of even some understanding for people that might have been in the industry before these have come to market. So personalized treatments will require precise GxP controls and innovative quality measures to meet GMP and GCP standards. Sustainability of integration. Regulatory agencies are pushing for sustainable measures and compliance, such as minimizing environmental impacts during drug productions, paper reduction acts, things like that. Balancing these initiatives with rigorous GxP requirements is also very challenging but very essential to ensure patient safety ultimately. And then audit preparedness. With more frequent and detailed regulatory inspections, companies need robust systems to ensure audit readiness, including real-time CAPA tracking and document management. And this is why the people involved in this are very critical to making sure this is successful. And I want to introduce Mary Beth Wall. She's the president and founder at Collide. It's an R&D IT consulting firm based in Cambridge, Mass, serving the scientific community since 2014. They support biopharmaceutical clients by implementing innovative R&D IT solutions and works with vendors to develop software offerings. The firm delivers consulting services across life sciences R&D, clinical and quality areas, specializing in software implementation, project management, training, and data migration. Mary Beth holds an MBA from Babson College and a master's in biophysical chemistry from Yale, with 20 years of experience in software product management and business development. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mary Beth.
Great. Thanks so much, John, for the kind introduction to the topic. And I'm really pleased to introduce our panelists today, our expert panelists. I'll just wait for the slide to pop up here. So first we have Shannon Brown. Shannon is a senior program management consultant at Collide with a background as a bench scientist in neuroscience and experience as a business manager for a global pharmaceutical research unit. Shannon brings deep expertise in project management for R&D facing projects at leading pharmaceutical companies. Welcome, Shannon. And then we have Danielle Duvereau, is a longtime collaborator with Collide. She is a versatile consultant since 2020 with Collide, specializing in project management, change management, and content development. Her background is in electrical and computer engineering, coupled with an MBA and agile expertise. She has shown that she can effectively deliver and support software solutions across diverse industries. And then finally, we have our friend Neera Mahesh, who is the founder and principal of Illuminera Consulting. She has over 18 years experience in operational leadership, product development, and strategic program management. Combining her foundation as a quality-minded bench scientist with her PMP, CSPO, and CSM certifications, she's worked to transform global team dynamics and drive business outcomes in the healthcare, IT, and digital health space. And her firm is based in the Boston area. So welcome to all the panelists. A little bit about Collide. Thanks for the introduction, John. As he mentioned, we are a boutique IT consulting firm based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We were established about 10 years ago. Most of our staff, 50%, have advanced scientific or management degrees. We do have a global team dispersed across the US, EU, and also with resources and collaborators in Asia Pac. We have several global clients. We work with primarily pharmaceutical companies and biotechs, ranging from a startup to multinational. We also work directly with R&D software vendors to support compliance, validation, documentation. We've also worked with scientific equipment vendors to help document their equipment and do qualification. Go to the next slide, please. A little bit about our professional services. This is our professional services wheel. Shows you the breadth of services we offer. So across the SDLC, we start with providing business analysis and, of course, project management expertise. As the project moves forward into the implementation stage, we support testing and validation, both GxP and non-GxP. We do organizational change management and strategic communications to support the implementation. Finally, we do learning and tech docs. We do SOP writing. We do a lot of technical documentation and training, including e-learning. And then finally, we have a specialty area where we focus on large-scale data migrations, specifically around cheminformatics data, to support system implementations and merging of legacy systems. So a little bit about project management, GxP. What do we mean when we say GxP project management? So as John alluded to, GxP is an umbrella term for good practices, which sets broad quality guidelines and standards, ensuring the safety, quality, efficacy, and of products that we consume that are manufactured and distributed by pharmaceutical, biotech, and med device firms in the regulated industries. The GxP project management in particular is the set of principles, processes, and practices that are necessary to support project management when you are subject to GxP regulations. And we'll talk about what examples of those regulations in just a moment. Why is it important? It's critical that you're compliant. If particularly for computerized systems, which is the focus of today's presentation, if you don't comply and you're audited, failure to comply can result in regulatory actions such as warning letters, fines, even product recalls. So it's really important that you have the proper support to show that you are compliant. So what do you need to do as a project manager? Some of the key components include planning, risk management, change control, document and content generation and management, auditing, and other activities just to ensure that you have data integrity in place and traceability of what you've done. Not all projects are regulated under GxP, and if you're in pharma, biotech, or med device industry, but the focus of this particular presentation is on GxP. We should note that there are other regulations that apply out there that we're not touching on, things like HIPAA, SOX, other standards and guidelines, ICH guidelines, ISO standards, the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. There's lots of other regulations which may increase the complexity of your work, but today we're focused on GxP, which is a typical use case for many of us out there working in computerized systems. So what are the regulations? So again, this is just the X is a placeholder referring to different areas of practice within the regulated industries. So if you're manufacturing a product, you're subject to GMP. If you're doing animal studies or non-clinical safety studies, you're subject to GLP. If you're running clinical trials, you have to be concerned with GCP. There's also post-marketing vigilance, so good pharmacovigilance practice, as well as good distribution practice in the supply chain. Overall, good documentation practices are important everywhere to ensure that you have the standards and guidelines in place, and that your documentation meets the Alcoa standard, Alcoa Plus, if you will, across the life cycle. I'll turn it over to Danielle to take us through the GxP and the project life cycle.
Sure. Thanks, Mary Beth. So here's just kind of a snapshot shot of the project lifecycle. I think it probably looks familiar to anybody who's been in and around project management. You've got your typical phases: planning, where you're establishing, your goals, your scope, your deliverables. You're probably doing an initial risk assessment just to get ahead of any key risks that you can anticipate. Then you're doing resource allocation and you're building that detailed project plan. Then you move into execution, and you're kind of monitoring that. And you may, depending on the project, have a quality step where you need approval from your quality team members. And then you move into kind of change management and monitoring and control, where you're obviously adjusting as you go and dealing with the unforeseen as it happens, managing your stakeholders until finally you're able to close out your project, right? So that's the typical project life cycle. And when we think about this in the context of GxP, there's a couple places where you want to pay special attention. So you'll notice that the QA oversight happens throughout the life cycle, and we'll talk about more about QA's role in the next slide. But planning is also an important phase to really think about GxP and what are the key requirements that you have that are specific to GxP, and how do you have to incorporate those into your planning. Risk assessment, again, what specific risks are tied to achieving and maintaining compliance in GxP, and obviously the quality step in a GxP project is, you will need that approval from your quality folks to ensure that your project is in compliance. So let's look at the next slide and talk a little bit more about that QA role and how we can partner with them. So the project manager is typically focused, their primary focus is on, completing the project, meeting the requirements, and kind of staying within that cost and schedule envelope that's been established in the planning phases. Your quality partner has a different role. Their focus is primarily on ensuring that your solution meets quality standards and complies with regulation. So using that lens, they're going to participate via oversight and compliance. So they're going to independently review and approve a lot of your plans and documentation, especially when you get into those later testing and validation stages. And they're going to do that to make sure that you're compliant with the necessary regulations and that you're achieving, your quality goals. And they're gonna have a role in system evaluation. In the planning phase, one of the first things that you're going to do is actually establish whether or not this solution needs to be GxP compliant. As Mary Beth said, within the industry, there are some activities and systems that will be GxP compliant and some where the regulations do not apply. So QA can help you in that first classification step. And then when it's determined that something needs to be GxP compliant, they're involved in the process of reviewing those requirements, looking at the solution proposed, making sure that solution will meet those requirements. And specifically when working with vendors for a GxP project, QA is often there to perform a vendor assessment or an audit to make sure that the vendor themselves is compliant with GxP processes. And then finally, QA will help you with your process control. So they're going to oversee validation, testing, and quality procedures, because it's not just what you deliver that needs to be GxP compliant, but it's also how you deliver a solution that needs to be compliant with the regulation. So they'll have a deep knowledge of not only what it means to be compliant with the regulations, but also they'll have an eye on any of your internal SOPs that govern how your organization specifically needs to be compliant. So just a couple of best practices when working with QA, as I mentioned on the last slide, involve them early and often to minimize surprises. You don't want to find out in the validation phase that something isn't compliant, and that's going to cause a lot of rework. And just remember that they're a very important partner and part of the team. They just have a different focus, right? And that's to ensure ultimately that the organization gets the best solution that's compliant. Also, you want to build overhead into your schedule for these activities, because you can see as QA is involved, they're going to give you feedback, and it's often going to take time to not only for them to give you the feedback, but for also then for you to incorporate that feedback into your plans and your design. So definitely build that into your schedule. And then just remember that you may need to negotiate. QA is going to identify areas of concern or risk. And that may require a conversation to actually find a path forward that's acceptable to all parties, to QA, to the project team, to the ultimate, consumer of your solution. So just some things to keep in mind when working with QA. And now I'll hand it over to Nira to talk about, project manager considerations.
Thanks, Danielle. Hi, everyone. So the previous slides really kind of talked about what GxP is and how that works. This one is really about a day in the life of the GxP project manager. So some considerations that you should have if you are running a GxP project and what that means for your project management actions. So the first one is really having an awareness and attention to the internal, which is your company or organization specific regulations versus external regulations. not saying that you have to be an expert in them, but it's really important that the project manager is well versed in sort of internal policies, processes, and particularly around the software development life cycle. This might be particularly important if there's policies around supplier selection, right? Or vendor selection. It's good to know that ahead of time because it can incorporate into your GxP project further down the line. And this is where a lot of the risk management or risks can be identified if you're aware of both the internal and the external regulations. The next one is just the acceptance of the evolution, ambiguity, and the geographic nuances of regulations. The previous slides outlined that there are going to be some geographic differences. So it's important for a project manager to have what I like to call a growth mindset versus a fixed one, right? You need to be aware of the fluidity of the regulatory environment, and flexibility is a must. And this, again, is where it's really important to develop that partnership with the quality leads because you want to engage them early on in your project and have an ongoing relationship with them so that they can sort of help you craft and design the rest of your project because they know what the quality targets are, right? They know what the requirements are. But as a project manager, you're going to be building out how we achieve those things on your project. The next thing to also keep in mind is that there are special and specific GxP document requirements. This is also where I like the phrase, if it's not documented, it didn't happen, right? So the project manager really needs to account for the additional quality planning and the SOP requirements that are going to be needed. And so this is where it's really important to factor these additional documents, the creation of them, so on, into your timeline when you're planning out your project. And it's also really important to think about the cross-functional engagement, the other people in the team that you may need to consult or pull in to provide inputs on some of this, in addition to the quality leadership. The next GxP consideration is the leadership and team member awareness of GxP regulation requirements. Um, there's going to be a lot of expectation management, stakeholder management, and proactive communications within the organization and your project team because you really shouldn't assume that everyone is familiar with GxP environments, particularly if you're going to be working with people that are from different functional domains. The GxP project manager really needs to be the person that um, pulls everyone together and also helps with some of the awareness and education. So there might be assumptions about timeline or how long things should take, but you need to educate people on some of the additional time that's required, especially if, as Danielle mentioned, there's a bit of negotiation where you have to go back and forth with quality leads, that things may take a little bit longer than they expect. So you, again, want to set that expectation up front and plan that in accordingly. The next consideration is the methodology that you're going to use for the project sort of needs to align with your GxP considerations. And so what we mean by this is how you run the project is really going to be dependent on some of the GxP considerations. You want to ensure that a suitable methodology is chosen and you understand the risks. not every project at every organization is going to be sort of a copy and repeat where there's a playbook already established and then you can pretty much follow that. There's going to be, there might be some need for tweaking the methodology or a little bit of customization to what exists in the organization. Maybe an iterative methodology would work in some cases, maybe something like that won't. So it's going to depend on what their known requirements are and what the other GxP considerations are. And then the final point I wanted to make here is the GxP considerations are in addition to quality and running a quality project, right? The requirements that are needed to ensure the safety of the patients and the animals in a GxP project is sort of parallel to the overall quality management of your project, because the project itself may have quality benchmarks or metrics that are needed at a company or organization wide level. So I'm talking about something like number of defects or number of recalls or NPS or satisfaction scores. And so those quality metrics are separate than the GxP considerations. So if you're running a GxP project, it's important to remember that GxP sort of sits concurrent and parallel to the project quality management itself. So I think we're on to the next slide, please, which is a poll. So
right.
the question here, sorry, go ahead, John.
Okay, I'll go. What is your biggest challenge when managing GxP projects? Is that, do I got the right one? Just to make sure. Yes.
Yep, that's the one. Thank you.
Okay. So let's take 1 minute and then we'll end the poll and share the results.
Hmm.
20 seconds. People are still taking a poll, so I'm letting it go a little longer. All right, I'm going to end the poll. Share results. So we've got nobody for maintaining compliance. Handling scope creep is at 67%. Managing resources is at 17%. Team collaboration, 50%. And QA oversight at 17%. So scope creep is the winner, followed by team collaboration. All right.
Yeah, I think that poll was a good segue into this case study. So I wanted to just point out some of our experiences, a particular case study that we had. I think you could think of this as scope creep and just not understanding the scope up front. In any case, the challenge we had was we had a client who needed to validate an existing laboratory system for use in GxP. The environment was used successfully for many users in non-GxP. And so we thought it would be a slam dunk to just take the same system, validate it, and use it for the regulated data capture as well. As we got into the project, as you know, when you are validating computer systems, you're subject to 21 CFR Part 11, which is a specific regulation enforced by the FDA that basically sets the criteria for accepting electronic records and signatures in place of paper. And you have to validate your IT systems against these requirements. And so I think as a team, just assumed that there wouldn't be any issues fundamentally with the Part 11 components in the product because we already had it in production. When we went to try to implement the system, what we found is that there were some major gaps in the actual vendor product with respect to several key features that are pertinent to the Part 11 regulation, including comprehensive audit trails. There were audit trails, but they were extremely superfluous and had almost too much information. They weren't human readable. You couldn't it was very difficult to decipher what actually happened just by looking at the audit trails, and they were a bit overwhelming. There was also an issue around global time zone support. So the system couldn't accurately record timestamps across different time zones, which was critical because it was a global system. And then there was also an issue with the e-signatures, that they lacked the necessary security and controls for electronic signatures. And so when we started this project, we didn't realize that we had a whole product development issue on our hands. And so the scope became much bigger than just doing a GxP validation. And I think this goes back to some of the things that Danielle had mentioned around planning being so important. In this case, we had done a vendor assessment, we had done the risk assessment, but we hadn't really done a product assessment, product risk assessment, if you will, against Part 11. And it sounds kind of fundamental, but it wasn't something that we thought of, or I think that we think of generally when we're doing assessments and making vendor selections. And so as a result of that, I think some of our key takeaways are shown here. I think planning is so important. I'll let Danielle kind of add some more color to this.
Yeah, so as Mary Beth mentioned, the client kind of found themselves in a bit of a pickle where what they thought was going to be a straightforward implementation got more complicated. So what we did, first of all, I can tell you what we did. So we worked with both the vendor and our QA partners to kind of fully identify those gaps and create, a project plan to address them, including, as Mary Beth mentioned, the validation process, because now you're not validating an out of the box system because now you've reopened it and you've done additional development. So the validation effort for that then became more intensive. So we were ultimately able to deploy this system, but obviously at a significant additional cost and impact to the schedule. So as Mary Beth mentioned, some of the key takeaways here. The first is thinking harder in that proactive planning phase. I think when the initial non-GxP instance of the system was deployed, there was a thought that there would be a follow-on GxP version. So as Mary Beth mentioned, if at that point in time they'd done a more thorough assessment of what their needs would be for both GxP and non-GxP, that could have influenced their selection of a system, or at least they would have built in that additional effort needed in the beginning, and it wouldn't have been a surprise later on. The second takeaway is again, if you're implementing a software system, selection of that system and vendor is critical, and that can determine how much additional work you're going to be able to do, or even if that application will ultimately be suitable. In this case, we were able to work with the vendor to get that additional development done, but there may be other instances where you get down the path and you realize, there's something fundamental that you can't change, right? And that you definitely don't want that to happen in your projects. And then the last key takeaway is that GxP compliance, is an additional investment in, both internally and potentially externally. And that's even if you are picking a solution that you think is compliant off the shelf, there will be that additional overhead to do your assessments, to pick your vendor, and ultimately there will be additional overhead in terms of the documentation and validation, as Neera mentioned. So even if your project goes as smoothly as possible, you will need to allow for that additional time and investment. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mary Beth for some overall key takeaways.
Yeah, so this is really a discussion for the panel. I won't read through the slide, but these are just some of our learnings, I think, guidance if you are managing a GxP project. And I'll just highlight a few that pop out to me and others can chime in. I think the partnership with QA and getting them involved early is, even during vendor selection, is really important. And in your planning, make sure you include the overhead, as Danielle said, involved in the additional documentation, the assessments you have to do when you're working under GxP. And just because you've done a vendor assessment doesn't mean you've done a product assessment. So just keep that in mind. People are increasingly adopting Agile as a way of working, and I do think there's a place for it in GxP, but you have to plan that out and think carefully about it. I don't know if anyone else has anything else they'd like to speak to on the panel.
Sure. I think one of the things that sticks out to me is when working with your team, not to assume that all members of the team are familiar with GxP and the associated process and requirements. You know, there's a lot of folks that have been, you know, even working in the industry a long time, but they may not have been working on GxP projects, or their role might have been such that they really weren't hands-on with a lot of these additional requirements. So, you know, definitely another important reason to partner with your QA, but just don't assume when you're doing the planning that everybody kind of understands all the implications.
Hi, that's a great point, Danielle, and I just wanted to chime in. I think my one of my favorites is really creating the foundation for governance um, for the decision making and risk mitigation. I really think it's worth it um, early on in your project to sort of set up a, a strong governance structure to make sure that when it comes to making decisions, the right people are in the room with as part of the discussion. And that really is driven a lot by the project manager. So, the bullet underneath that, be the deputy of the project. Absolutely. The project manager is not just sort of going through a checklist of tasks. It's much more than that. It's about pulling the whole team together, motivating everyone, and really, listening and asking questions too.
All right. So for this poll, which of these takeaways would have the greatest impact in your organization? So let's shoot for a minute, minute and a half again for this poll. Everybody knows how to do it now, so might go faster. All right. I think we're going to end it. Share results. So number one, making the culture shift. Quality as a mindset and not an endpoint is number one. That's actually good to see. Providing proactive training on GxP for project teams is number two at 29%, and leverage agile methodologies to increase efficiency at 14%.
Great. So we're coming to the end of our time. I thought we would close by talking a little bit about some trends we see for the future if you're a GxP project manager, and things that will impact the industry. So I think there are four key takeaways that we've identified. I think we're seeing increasing adoption of agile and hybrid methodologies in the context of GxP. Our customers are putting out SDLCs and specific versions of the SDLC that are agile GxP guidance documents. So if you are a PM, and just make sure if you are trying to do agile that you are aware if there is an agile SOP, or if there isn't one, what are the boundaries defined in the existing documentation. We're also seeing an impact of AI on project management, things like automating documentation, automating the creation of release notes, risk prediction and mitigation. Also, I mean, automated testing and validation. I was at a conference a few weeks ago where they actually talked about um, removing the need for end user testing directly, and doing that all via AI and automated methods. So as a result of some of these impacts and disruptions, there will be impacts in the regulatory landscape. And so I think as those regulations evolve, we have to be aware of how things change. You know, what will be acceptable for testing and validation in the future? Can you use an algorithm rather than a user acceptance test? What's that impact to data integrity and traceability? And also, what's the impact with respect to cybersecurity and data privacy? I do think that as we go forward, there will be big changes that will impact GxP. And as a PM or a team member, you have to stay ahead of the curve. And that brings us to the last point around upskilling for the future. So if you are a PM, making sure you're aware of regulatory changes coming related to AI, ML. Um, you know, make sure you have those soft skills to work cross-functionally across the organization, and agile methodologies. You know, understand it's complex if you are running an agile project. XP, there are certainly complexities and different tools you may use. So you may have to learn a new tool or two to do that. So just be aware that there is an investment in your skill set going forward. I don't know. Does anyone else want to add anything to this slide before we conclude?
Right, poll number 3. Oops, back. Hold on. So, which of these trends do you expect to have the greatest impact in the next 5 years? And I think you can write it in. Is that correct, everybody?
It looks like.
Yeah. We have one answer so far. Two answered. About 30 seconds.
I feel like it's a quiz on the content because you have to remember the answers.
All right. Oh, we got 4 answered. I'm going to wait till I'm going to give everybody 2 minutes. So another 30 seconds. Ten seconds. All right, pencils down. Turn your paper over. So let's view the details, see if that worked. Okay, so I'm not sure if you guys can see the screen, so I might have to read it to you. So the first answer was AI user testing, use AI for risk prediction, AI impacts, AI ML, and AI. So AI has taken the cake, I think, for this. All right. Should we proceed to the Q&A? Let's see if any questions have come in. We've got some. Let's all go on camera. Q&A. Okay. In your experience, at what point in a project do companies bring in QA to evaluate clinical vendors? So
In my experience, they bring them in very early. I was involved in a project where the customer was trying to select a platform for a decentralized clinical trial solution. And many of the vendors were startups, some of them were more established, but QA was right there in the beginning, um, looking at the RFP and participating in that process and had their own set of requirements that the vendors were asked about. So at least that was my experience, was very, very early.
Yeah, and from my experience, it's often required by those internal SOPs that an organization has. There's just a lot of, the organization will basically state, you really need to get that QA evaluation before you can, really enter into a lot of the contract negotiations that you want to do. So I agree. I've seen it pretty early.
anybody else want to comment on that? There's probably a little bit of a cultural aspect to that as well, right? Having inclusion with the different groups sooner than later kind of drives a better process. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I was just gonna add to that that I also agree engaging very early on. Had a slightly different experience where um, you know, QA was sort of engaged a little bit later than you would expect. So a bit of a lesson learned. And part of that is because some other functional areas sort of didn't sort of see the need for it, right? We'd never done it before, so why would we do it now? Um, everything was okay, so we got everyone onboarded, but I would recommend the earlier the better. And even if you're in the part of your project where it's right at the beginning, still just reaching out and saying, hey, this is coming down the line. And are there things that we should consider? I think that that also helps establish the relationship if you don't already have it. And then it puts you in a better position than getting caught.
Yeah, and
I
I
would
think
also just add, I think some things, some projects I've seen um, sort of want to exclude QA until they're ready for them.
Right.
But that's a flawed strategy because it also there is a change in management component to that. Normally you have to involve them. It's part of the SOP, but you don't need to make things perfect before you show it to QA. They're really your partner, and you need to establish that relationship very early to be successful.
yeah, yeah, and I think to Nira's point, I think on some of the projects we've done, when our partner is the IT organization and it's part of their process, they are very good about getting QA involved early because their business is deploying software solutions. But to Nira's point, if there's other areas of the organization that are actually raising the need for a new software system, then I think that's where some of those steps might get missed early because it's not their bread and butter. It's not what they do all the time. So, you may have to be the little voice that says, hey, have we thought about the QA implications? Because it just might not be second nature for them.
Another thing that I've seen, I would just bring up is this idea that the business says the system is in GxP, and they do that without any input from quality, and then you later have issues, and the quality group says no, this is GxP. So that's another really good reason to involve them early and not just sort of go off on your own, make that decision, partner with them and make that determination early rather than trying to exclude them from activities and just make decisions unilaterally because it will cost you later in rework and time.
All right. We have a statement type question here from Jessica. Interesting that I've heard the mention of AI replacing user testing a couple of times here. AI should not replace user testing, just help make it easier, faster, more accessible. Users are humans and therefore should be involved, especially in user acceptance testing. So
Mhm.
I thought I'd bring this to everybody here and see what everybody thinks about that and maybe what the change policy or how that change management of that should go forward. And should it ultimately always include humans or, based on what Jessica said?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think so I do not disagree. I think with any new technology, the first thing you hear is all of the very optimistic projections of what a new technology is going to do. And I think for AI specifically, I mean, we're all going to live on the beach, right? Because there's going to be no need for people anymore and AI is going to do everything, right? So I think we all have some kind of concept that that's not the case. And I think we're still trying to figure out where AI and machine learning can really add value and where where you need more hands-on approach or even a different approach. Maybe it's technology, but it's not AI. And I think in a lot of places, AI can make more of a mess than it solved if it's not used properly, right? Because your algorithm is only as good as the data that it trained on and everything else. So I agree that I think there will continue to be a very big role for people in the validation process and how AI gets incorporated. I think is a big open question, and I don't know at this point. I'm unwilling to predict the future because I don't know what's going to come out of it and what regulatory bodies are going to allow you to do versus not want to take the risk on. So that's my 2 cents, but I'll let others weigh in.
Yeah, I agree with that, Danielle. I think AI sort of it's a tool, right? And it's a broad brush term, I think, but I think that there's always going to be human intervention that's needed. We can't rely on machines completely or as you said logic that is based on a fixed data set, right? Because the AI tools are only as good as the data it's trained on. So I think that as long as you're going to have users that are human, you're going to need users that are human doing the testing. And yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
I would agree with that. I think that you have to keep an open mind. I think AI will maybe expedite the traditional ways of testing and user acceptance, maybe provide more automated evidence. But if a user is entering data in a system, the user needs to test and verify that they can use the system. There's no way around that unless you replace the user altogether. So but I think it will automate and change the way we test. I just don't think it will replace the human. I would absolutely agree with that. Just maybe faster, maybe more efficient.
Right. All right. We probably have time for this last question. I was in the poll, I was pleasantly surprised to see about culture. Um, what are the biggest challenges organizations face when implementing a culture of quality in GxP projects, and how can these challenges be overcome? That's I think because culture actually is where it all starts. If you have the right culture, other things fall into line and can be done more efficiently or easier. But what do you think?
My take on this is the culture starts with awareness. So if people don't understand why they're doing this, what is GXP? Why do I have to do this? That's kind of fundamental. And if I think having that, the first step to promoting quality culture is to have the proper training for people to understand what is GXP, why are we doing it, why is it important, why is it useful? And I think that's at least the starting point. A lot of times you get teams that are don't have a lot of experience. It may be very experienced developers or testers or business analysts. Maybe they've never done GXP and they don't know why they're doing this extra paperwork. And it can be a bit frustrating, but helping people understand the why and making that a goal is an important thing that sometimes is missed in the beginning when you're just trying to get something in a timeline that you have that's tight.
Yeah, and to build off of that, Mary Beth, I think this is where a project manager can really use some of those soft skills to help bring that culture up to the forefront. You know, project managers sit at a very unique nexus between a lot of different individuals within a company. And so they can really exercise those skills to maybe make sure that quality's message isn't getting lost in a lot of other information, and making sure that the business can kind of hear it in a way that they need to hear it and understand the value that they bring. And I think that's where a project manager can add some serious value.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think there's truth to the adage that you get what you measure. So I think also, I mean, as a project manager, we're absolutely, we're tracking, do the tasks get done, and do they get done in a timely fashion? And I think, it behooves us to put also emphasis on, the quality metrics and milestones as well, because I think if all you're telling your team is let's get it done, then that's what they're going to do. But if you're telling them, hey, sometimes you need to slow down to go faster, and we need to spend more time up front on this documentation, and again, to Mary Beth's point, if you can illustrate the why. But I think if you're measuring it, you're much more likely to get folks to come along with you when they can see it.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with everything that's already been said. And one of the things I think to remember is when it comes to why, right? The reason that GxP is in place is ultimately to protect the humans and animals that are going to be affected or impacted by these innovations that are coming out of the organizations, right? So that right there is a very important why. That's the foundation of it, right? With everything, that is the reason why this is being done. It's not just additional documentation. It's not just additional. It's the purpose of having the responsibility to make sure that people and animals are safe, and that is really foundational. And so I think if that is the message also, why, that's a pretty strong message for teams to adopt.
Absolutely. All right. Well, this has been great. I mean, got some good feedback in the chat there. Want to thank everybody today. We could probably have another one of these where we just do a roundtable and discuss, just do a roundtable on this. So if everyone's interested, maybe we'll do that next year as a follow-up. But I thought it was great. I learned a lot. So want to thank everybody and wish them happy holidays and a happy new year. I know it's we've got a little bit of time to go, but I might not see some of you before then. So thank you. And thanks everyone for taking time to attend today. All right. It's a wrap. Thank you.
Thank
Great job,
you.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.